Hello and welcome to all viewers of this session. My name is Cody Freeman and I use all pronouns and I'm coming at you live from Bangkok, Thailand. I'm the founder and CEO of the Global Center, which is an NGO that creates freedom through education for LGBTI+ youth globally. And at the Global Center, we really conceptualize education broadly because education is happening all around us all the time. So it's in schools with youth and teachers, administrators, in healthcare settings with doctors and nurses, and also in workplaces and organizations, which is why I'm extremely honored to be hosting this session of the Queer Youth Dialogues today, which will focus on the private sector and its intersections with LGBTIQ youth and workers. The dialogues are hosted in partnership with the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, the Office of the Independent Expert of Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, ILGO World, and the Global Queer Youth Network. For the next 1.5 hours, we'll be inviting various speakers to discuss different initiatives to pave the way for inclusion of LGBTIQ youth in the private sector, and ask speakers to share their own experiences as young LGBTIQ people engaged in workplace rights, in research, and activism. My goal for our time together today is that this will be a comfortable space and an action-oriented space where we're able to rumble with some difficult questions, but also remain hopeful about the unique power that queer individuals and businesses have on LGBTIQ rights around the world. Now, before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. We have simultaneous translations to French and Spanish. You can choose your preferred language by following the instructions in the chat box. If you face any technical difficulties or issues during the event, the Q&A option is open and we should be able to help you there. And additionally, for safeguarding reasons, all participants except for the speakers will have their cameras and audio options off. Thank you for understanding that. Now, we would like to begin our dialogue by discussing some of the different ways the private sector has been using advocacy to pave the way for meaningful LGBTQI inclusion in our first segment named Beyond Pride, Creating Meaningful Change. To speak about how the private sector can use its advocacy and its power beyond their walls to enhance LGBTIQ people's lives everywhere, we have 3 amazing speakers. First, I'll ask them to introduce themselves, please, before we move into the conversation. So let's start with Guchatan.
Thank you very much, Cody. Hi, everyone. My name is Guchatan. Most people know me as Nanu. My pronouns are he, they. I work at the International Labour Organization on the principle of non-discrimination and equal pay for work of equal value. In addition to that, I'm also the president of UN Globe, the group that represents LGBTIQ+ personnel and dependents in and across the United Nations system. It's a pleasure to be here and look forward to conversing with you all. Thank you.
Incredible. Happy you're here too. Can we hear from Gareth next?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Excuse me. My name's Gareth Worley. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in the UK. I'm here representing 2 organizations, actually. So first of all, I'm the Global Director of Inclusion, Belonging and Connection for the Coca-Cola Company. And as part of my remit, I also get to represent the PGLE, which is the Partnership for Global LGBTI Equality. And that's a collection of companies and civil society organizations working together to advance LGBTIQ inclusion globally. And so delighted to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, happy you're here as well. And last but not least, Mariana.
Hi everyone, I'm Mariana. I'm Germany-based. I'm a German-Brazilian activist. I work with different organizations and different groups, and I'm here because I think I have a perspective where I've worked with people who try to advance social changes via corporations, via their own work environment, but also with grassroots activists who often are very critical of those initiatives. And I'm here to bring in both perspectives.
Lovely. I cannot wait to engage you in that. So we know that creating a welcoming workplace fosters development for all, and that much of our lives are spent at work, and that LGBTQI people, many of them face unemployment, underemployment, and discrimination at work. So my first question is, why is the private sector an impactful actor in LGBTQ rights advocacy? And maybe let's go in the order of introductions and then go from there. Guchatan.
Well, I think the private sector has got definitely a key role to play. You know, many of us spend a substantial amount of time in the world of work, and what we need to see is that globally, employers are taking a lead in making workplaces more inclusive. And I think it's not just in terms of workplaces, it's also advocacy at the international and global arena as well, where businesses and multinationals have got a seat at the table in key negotiations through their representative organizations, such as the International Organization of Employers, where they come together and actually provide key inputs onto the world of work. Now, making the workplace safe, but it's not just about the workplace in itself, it's also about how do we provide an enabling environment for workers to get to the workplace. Let's look at housing, healthcare, schooling, education. And this is where employers, and in particular the private sector, need to play a critical role in having a say. Look, we need to make sure our employees have good housing, so that they can actually have suitable accommodation for themselves. They need to have good health so that they can actually be healthy at work. They also need to have the right qualifications and schooling. So it's very critical that the private sector play a role in this to ensure that they have the enabling environment is there so that their employees can actually engage in work in a safe environment.
Yeah, very well said, and how all of these things are interlinked as queer people, right? And as people. How about Gareth? Can I ask you, why is the private sector an important actor?
Yeah, and I would expand it. I would say it's the private sector and all employers, actually. You know, you don't have to be a private sector employer to have an impact in this space. If we think about it from an employment perspective, first of all, as my colleague said, we spend up to 12 hours a day, some of us in the workplace, whatever that may look like. So if we're not able to feel our authentic self while we're doing that, we're clearly not going to be at our best, both personally and professionally. And so there's a real interest in, the success that comes from everybody being authentically themselves in the workplace. So the more that we can do as employers to create environments where not only are discrimination and harassment not allowed and there's zero tolerance, but actually where there's really active, promotion and engagement, and a really vibrant environment where people from all backgrounds can thrive. So that's where I would start, is just the environment of employment in of itself. But I think where the private sector and maybe more employers than the private sector also comes in is, how do we then go beyond the four walls of the organization? How do we show up in the world to demonstrate our support for the LGBTIQ community in whatever sense that means? And that can be through community activity, it can be through, the way that our products and our marketing is representing the community. And it can also be through the ways that we choose to advocate for causes in certain countries in the world. Let's face it, many employers are global, including my own. We have employees who live in countries where same-sex relationships and trans and non-binary identities are criminalized. And so that provides a real challenge. And that's something that, as a member of the PGLE, we're really working towards. How do we address those kinds of challenges in meaningful ways that don't get ahead of what those countries are ready for, but also send strong signals, especially to employees in organizations, of acceptance?
Really interesting to hear about those tensions. How about you, Mariana? What do you think?
I think my two fellow speakers already described the situation perfectly. I would just maybe go one step further and say those different levels that we talked about, like the inside perspective that we need a safe environment for LGBTIQ workers and employees, and that's one aspect. The marketing aspect is also very important because so much of our images of our thoughts are influenced by advertisement. So corporations can also use this for positive social change, but also use the political leverage that they have on an international basis, on a local level, supporting organizations. And I think that's where the tension comes from, because for example, often it happens that a corporation does a lot of work to include LGBTIQ people at the workspace, to make them feel safe and welcome, but maybe on another level, they don't do the same work, which is also often hard, because especially when we're talking about multinational corporations, it's not always the same people who make the decisions. And that's also where I think a lot of resentments from many LGBTIQ teenagers come from, because they see people or corporations saying, we do a lot of work, and maybe that's true, but not in all areas.
That's so interesting. What I'm hearing both from Guru-chan and Mariana especially are like decisions, key decision makers, having a meaningful seat at the table, and how to do that in a complex, like global aspect, and who's making those decisions. So going with that about barriers, Guru-chan, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to build on Gareth's point as well, that we have to also recognize the diversity of the private sector. You know, we know that 20% of the private sector are multinationals. Then we have a large economies that are made up of small, micro to medium-sized enterprises, and we can't forget the essential role that they play, right? And how they can also play, because a lot of the focus tends to be on just the multinationals. Let's not forget the small, the micro enterprises, you know, the LGBTIQ plus individuals who are out there owning their own businesses as a one-person, shop, for so to speak. So I think it's also that, how do we get those voices heard as well and engaged? How can even LGBTIQ plus entrepreneurs support the LGBTIQ plus community as well? And I think that's also a critical question to ask. How do we provide an enabling platform to get those small businesses and engaged into that conversation? And that's a big challenge right now, I think, across the world. And also, let's not also forget that the global workforce is 40% in the formal economy and 60% in the informal. We've got a sector we've only hitting 40%, yet we've still got 60% of the global workforce in the informal economy. How do we help formalization? How do we get them into vulnerable people? In fact, where you're going to find most LGBTIQ plus people into the formal economy. I think that's where private sector can play a key role. How do we help businesses and the administrative processes for businesses to become registered and set up and established, credit schemes, peer-to-peer learning, etc. So just some thoughts there. I just wanted to add on those points. So, sorry to interrupt there. Thank you.
I love it because it leads to my next point. If I can stick with you about barriers, what do you think are the key barriers that stand in the way? And it could be even for organizations and like making decisions around it, or for queer people in organizations to be in leadership positions while they're advocating for rights?
Well, I think I'm going to speak from I wear numerous hats. So, not just UN Global President, but also in the ILO. So as a lead of an ERG, of an employee resource group, business resource group, a lot of the championing of LGBTI rights or any form of equality, be it on disability, be it on gender, race, you have these ERGs which actually led by members of those communities, from marginalized communities, right? And research is upcoming, and additional research needs to be done that, in fact, championing equality in these organizations is left on the heads and shoulders of those marginalized persons, right? So we as queer people are championing equality in our organizations, and we're doing this on our own time. I'm doing this on my own time in the UN. So how am I going to be compensated for the time I am losing that I'm not spending on my career, but I am spending on championing equality in the growth? So am I being given time off? One, am I compensated for my time? Secondly, in the private sector in particular, we know that D&I leads to financial growth of the organization. It reaps a financial dividend, right? But is that dividend going back to those communities who inside the organization that are working for it? The answer often is no, and that's me with my aspect of that of my leaders in the ERG within the UN system. And I think the other aspect is then, who are in these ERG posts? Do we see the same people over and over again? We have the same problem even in UN Globe, United Nations system, ERG, predominantly cis white gay men from Northern European, North America, who are representing a whole diverse community. And, I'm the only person of color and faith on the whole coordination network. And that is the United Nations system. And you're like, hang on, and therefore we reflect what's inside. So how do we ensure that's, those diverse voices are actually leading us? And that's number two. Then I think in the workplace in itself, you've got other critical concerns for employers. How do employers have that enabling environment? If I'm doing this, how is it a level playing field for me to ensure that if my business is championing diversity at a cost, that there is a cost involved, which you do reap the dividends on, how do we make sure that everyone else is doing the same? How do we make sure that some of this framework is not just a sustainability exercise or a PR exercise or a CSR exercise that's entrenched, therefore it becomes entrenched in law, therefore it doesn't go backwards. Right, so that's the second part. And then I think is the other aspect is the intersectional lens. How do we mainstream LGBTI issues throughout? It's not just about getting us into the workplace, like you clearly pointed out. It's about career progression. Those pink ceilings, how do we hit those? We're looking at things like equal pay of work of equal value. Right now, we know we're only focusing on men and women. How do we focus on all diverse genders, race, and that plays into it as well? We know that the studies being done in the UK, for example, that looking at gay men in the workplace, that gay men of color are worse off in comparison to their white counterparts. We see that element being placed. How do we replicate those studies elsewhere as well? So I think it's not just about getting us in, it's about getting us getting our issues or LGBTIQ plus issues mainstreamed into the workplace, whether it's on occupational safety and health, on equal pay, entitlements and benefits, sort of going beyond that narrative of, just individual rights, but more wider rights as well. And I think we haven't even started on the intersex issues. When it comes to intersex and intersex bodies, you're looking at occupational safety and health. How do certain chemicals and certain reactions, we know that there are regulations out there about how certain chemicals and certain chemicals or biohazards react with certain types of bodies. Not enough research, again, not done on intersex bodies. Perhaps I think I've spoken too much, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Can we continue on with Mariana with both of your hats everywhere? Yeah.
I would love to respond to that, or rather to expand on one or 2 points, because I also want to emphasize that when we're talking about inclusion at the workplace, we cannot talk about inclusion without considering other dimensions of diversity, of identity, of different forms people are marginalized, not also because of how they intersect with LGBTIQ identity, but also because it's the right thing to do and important for an inclusive work environment. So a diversity management concept, or general an approach inside the corporation to really include people from different marginalized identities is fundamental to this. And I also want to highlight how important it is to have a social security net. And some people have been lucky enough to have been born in a country where the government provides this to different extents. Others have to rely on their employer. And this is also a very important role, especially when we're not talking about high qualified LGBTIQ people, but LGBTIQ people who've dropped out of school, who are homeless, who have faced all different kinds of hardship, and reintegration programs, social security networks, healthcare that is trans and intersex inclusive. Those are all very important things, and independent of what you think how much a role the government should play in this, the private sector can step in where it does not currently, and therefore can play a fundamental role in advancing LGBTIQ inclusion.
Mariana, I think you make a really strong point around many strong points both of you have, but let me pick on the healthcare point for a second. You know, private sector organizations often, you know, offer their employees medical coverage, and especially in countries where the national provision is insufficient. Of course, that's a wonderful thing, but it is often woefully lacking in areas that are related to LGBTIQ families or LGBTIQ identities. And I think that's something that really needs some further thought. You know, there are opportunities for global organizations to look at that differently, and even think about where, you know, like I mentioned, plenty of countries where trans and non-binary identities are criminalized. Can you offer something at a global level which almost extracts from the country and takes away that challenge? Because that's the kind of power that an organization can have, where, you know, you wouldn't be able to do that on a personal or individual level. So I think that's something that is a development and something that organizations should be looking at as they review their policies around things like benefits and healthcare. Picking up on a point that Nanu made earlier around ERGs, so employee resource groups, we call them inclusion networks at Coca-Cola. I think the point about these being part-time on the side roles and not being compensated directly is really crucial. We're making some efforts to provide some recognition for the people who carry out those roles from a financial perspective. But it doesn't take away from the fact that it's always going to be a job on the side, and the fact that you're relying on people who have a passion as well as a day job to be your drivers of change. And they're wonderful things, and I love spending time with our inclusion networks and the leaders. But I do often have that thought that says, you know, it could be a lot more. And I think that's something for us all to think about as well. There are organizations that do pay full-time ERG leader roles. They tend to be the biggest companies of the world, you know, the ones with hundreds of thousands of employees, which you know, there's not that many of. But I think asking individuals to really carry the burden of change without the right level of executive sponsorship, without the right level of connection into the business and linked to the business strategy, is only setting them up for failure. So I think one of the really big things that we can all do as organizations is make sure that there's leadership commitment, executive sponsorship, and that it's not just left to the ERG leaders on their own to be the drivers of change.
Do you mind if I switch, Gareth, and keep on you about some of the good practices you're seeing, either within your company or in other organizations? It could be supports you see, tools, resources, campaigns. What are some good practices?
I think some organizations are really good at bridging the inside outside kind of very well, and really showing that they mean it through their actions, both internally and externally. So my constant fear or my constant concern is, are we balancing that well as an organization? So the last thing you want to be is rainbow washing on the outside and all of your employees inside feeling like, what about me? You're not living up to that promise inside. But likewise, you don't want your employees to be frustrated by, okay, we've got an ERG and we're doing communications internally, but what are we making a difference in the world? So, so really balancing that well, I think, is where organizations can get it very, very right. I used to work for Procter & Gamble a long time ago. I started my career there 20 years ago, when I probably could still class myself as a queer youth. Sadly, not anymore. I'm 43, just for transparency. And just, you know, having worked for that organization and seeing what they do these days with, you know, their marketing, with, you know, utilizing certain brands very carefully to very authentically represent, you know, certain parts of the LGBTIQ community. So, for example, there was a Pantene shampoo advert which was around a transgender person washing their hair. It was quite powerful. They also did one with Gillette, and it was the first shave of a trans man. You know, they're doing things that are really important for the world to see. But I know from having worked there and from knowing people who still work there, that their focus on that work internally is just as potent and just as powerful, and very welcoming as an organization. So I call that out as one example of organizations that really balance things well internally and externally. As an organization, we've been looking very hard at the work that we do on social justice. And you'll all be familiar that the world's focus on social justice ramped up in 2020 after unfortunate events in the Black community in the US. And that did lead to an unfortunate kind of misunderstanding around parts of the world that social justice was actually about racial equity. And of course, it's way beyond that. Social justice is about where access to opportunity and involvement in decision making and actually just human rights are compromised because of your identity or your status as a marginalized group. And so the role that organizations can play in addressing those issues where they can authentically make a real difference is really important. So I've been leading a project internally about really making sense of social justice on a global stage, making sure that the concept of social justice applies to the LGBTIQ plus community, as well as all of these other identities, and that we should be looking out for these things happening in the world and deciding very consistently whether and how, you know, we choose to engage and make a difference. So they're just a couple of examples. Cody, I hope that helps.
Can I ask you a question? Because I actually don't know, and maybe for the youth in the audience, of how do the decisions get made? Is it the ERG groups? Is it the marketing team and someone brings it up? Is it the, you know, senior leadership? How can people create change in companies?
I mean, I can't talk for every organization. Obviously, the way that we look at it is there are some clearly pivotal roles in the organization that have the right level of oversight, the right level of experience, and the right level of seniority in an organization to take account of lots of different potentially conflicting factors and make decisions about whether we move into action or move into, you know, listening or, you know, whatever it might be. So most often that might be the head of a public affairs and communications function, the head of an HR function. You might have legal folks involved. You might indeed have marketing involved, depending on the issue and the potential action that you decide on. But it's a very, very, very complex space, and not one to be undertaken lightly by people who might not have that, you know, that level of oversight that I mentioned.
This talks about like a practical gap of like, I mean, if you're 10 to 15 years of experience and you start working, then that's beyond youth age already. So like, how do we get youth topics represented? But maybe, oh.
Yeah, and let me respond to that very quickly. I think one of the key things is obviously making sure that there is a feedback loop with the employee resource group so that it's not happening in isolation and you know, no communication and decisions are made without them being part of the conversation. You know, one of the things that we at Coke have been doing a lot more of and continue to do with ever increasing intensity very generally is employee listening. So whether that's through surveys, focus groups, through the ERGs, whatever it might be, you know, to really make sure that we've constantly got an ear to what are our employees looking for us to do as an organisation, whether that be internal practices, whether it be the voice that we have externally. So making sure that that loop is in existence is of course important. But the other balance is of course the balance of activism versus the realities of what it is being a business and having a license to operate in a particular country. And there are sometimes real, you know, challenges in balancing those things. So yeah, it's a complex space.
I would like to add on to this to build on the point I made earlier, because when we're talking about how to engage younger people, what I said earlier, we only see the outside output. We don't see all those processes which go on in the company, and many still haven't made firsthand experiences. And at least in my personal experience, many queer youth are also, their activism isn't limited to queer rights, but is intersected in a way with social justice that often goes opposed to many of the goal those big corporations have. But it is also important for us, and I say us as like activists, young people who don't have this inside perspective, to know that that a corporation doesn't have like one interest, because it's like not one person with one will, but many conflicting interests. And of course, profit is always the overarching goal, especially when we're talking about bigger companies. I mean, when we're talking about smaller queer-led businesses, which are very tied to the community, that's also like a very different setting. But for us, it's important to recognize that just because there is this overarching goal of profit, it doesn't mean that the work the people inside the community, the corporations do, isn't genuine and strives towards betterment of the society. And this is a very hard balance to find as an activist on the outside, to know to what extent can I trust this corporation, and I think the next panel will go into more detail on this, but also to what extent can I judge their efforts genuine, because we don't have this inside perspective.
Mm.
Nanu, do you want to share piggyback hopping some else, or yeah? Example?
Yeah, so this is on good practices. And you know what? I love the fact, I think this is the first time I've been in a panel discussion where people have mentioned the word social justice, and the ILO's specific mandate is on social justice. So Gareth, after this conversation, you know, we'd love to connect with you on this project and see what synergies we can have on this. And I'm sure you're already working with us on this with perhaps other colleagues within the ILO. Look, I'll give you three good examples, one from the ERG perspective, one from the UN perspective, and one external. So we as UN Globe, we have to walk the talk, right? So we have this problem where we don't have that diversity. How do we ensure the diversity exists? So what happened before was that a lot of the leads of our chapters, you know, were voluntary. Someone put their hand up and said, I will do this. We've changed that. It's now a nomination process. People can nominate themselves. They can now team up. But if they team up, they can't be the same two people. They can't be the same two genders. They can't be the same two sexual orientations, job categories. They can't be the same ethnicity, nationality, or geographic region. So i.e. you cannot have one person from France, one from the UK. And if it's what we call a chapter, an agency chapter, then they can't be in the same location. One of the areas that we've been blindsided by is actually the youth voice as well. How do we ensure and engage with the youth voice as well? And we're encouraging that young people to engage and become part of UN Globe Leads. And how have we done that? Because we've seen a lot of JPOs, what we call junior professional officers in the UN, become now able to sign up and become chapter leads as well as consultants. That's where you'll find a lot of young people, youth in the UN system. So that was number one. A good example. If we're going to fight systemic discrimination or structural discrimination, we need structural procedures and processes in place for that outcome to happen. Number two, when we engage within the UN system, and a lot of you may be thinking, well, why the UN? Why does UN Globe exist? And a lot of you who are listening today may be thinking, you know what, I want to work in the UN one day. And great, fantastic. We're trying to create that change where LGBTIQ plus people can come into the UN system and work safe and feel included. However, we have big challenges such as our application forms. We still have an application form that says, please identify your gender, and it says M or F, and that's it. We're now currently working to bring those changes about to how can we do this as well with our legal complications and the legal challenges that we have that many corporations may face as well. So that's one, and we're making sure that we are the voice at that table. So we're engaging, and we're not just engaging with management directly, we're also engaging more broadly on other staffing issues, on precarity, on mobility. We're teaming up with our staff unions and staff associations. So it's not just a LGBTIQ plus issue like Mariana pointed out, it's a we issue. So that's very, very important, I think. And then thirdly, I think in terms of good practices and good examples, look, in a project we're currently leading in Brazil called Kitchen and Voice, we're helping LGBTIQ plus people, in particular trans people who have come out of, who may not even have the basic qualifications to access the world of work, let alone access what we call technical vocational educational training, right? So to even get into vocational training, you need basic literacy, numeracy. They don't even have that. So what can you do? How can you even be trained on a job? So what we've done is identify a course, a TVET course, a vocational training course, which doesn't require basic national qualifications. So that was the first step. But at the end of that goal, you've trained someone. What next? What are you going to do? So at the other side, we've partnered up with organizations and companies in Brazil. It's a network of 300 companies who've come together and said, right, your cohort of trainees, let us meet them and interview them. And we've been able, out of cohort of nearly 477 plus trainees, we've getting over 70% have now are now in formal employment. The others have chosen to go on and set their own businesses up. So yes, it has to be sort of done correctly, where you can't just provide training programs, or the government can't just provide. You have to have partners in place and the private sector in place, ready to onboard some of your beneficiaries in place. So some good practices at different levels there for you. Thank you, Cody.
Thank you. I have a question in the Q&A for Gareth, referring to Mariana's comments about profit being an overarching interest. How do companies like Coca-Cola deal with countries where there are no LGBT rights, where there even be the death penalty, like in the 7 countries that have the death penalty for LGBT people? How do you advocate there?
The answer is it's very difficult to, and actually that's one of the beauties of coalition and being able to join hands with other companies and with civil society organizations to advocate for change in ways that are sensitive to those situations. So behind closed doors conversations rather than big kind of out there statements is kind of an obvious thing to say. But I think driving change within a country where rights do not exist, where criminalization exists to varying degrees, is never going to be led by one company's voice. But what companies can do is come together with civil society to talk behind closed doors, to have conversations with governments about the issues, and to use platforms like, for example, Davos, the World Economic Forum's annual event to really shed light on the issues and to really find paths to drive change. the private sector has a role, but it's not the only role. And you know, we'd be fools to think that companies can drive that change alone. On the point about profit over progress, if I can call it that, or you know, whatever the right term would be, ultimately businesses have to make money to survive. So if you're you can't expect a business not to focus on that, because the power to make change then does go away, right? So there has to be again a balance on that versus the contribution to society and the social impact. But I think, you know, like all organizations, you know, we are very focused on ESG actions, right? So environmental, social, and governance actions, which are aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and principles. And that's part of it as well. So I think balancing it, being focused on it, and joining hands with other organizations to help drive change would be a short answer to a very complex question.
Thank you for that. Thank you for engaging in that. Yeah, Mariana,
Yeah.
maybe you can ask the last question and then you could work it into this. So just because we have 5 minutes for this panel, what do you think are the biggest recommendations for organizations, those that are listening right now in the chat? And Mariana, yeah, let's start with you.
That actually goes pretty well with what I wanted to say. Great.
Perfect.
I think one of the fundamental problems when we're talking about the public sector as an agent, as an actor of change, is that governments are supposed to be accountable and transparent in a democracy. If they are accountable and transparent, that's another question, but there's this imperative that they are supposed to be this, while companies, they're mostly accountable towards their shareholders, and they can say that they do something towards the public, but when you say, Gareth, that a lot of it happens backdoors, one problem is that we as the people, we don't know what actually happens. Of course, in politics this happens too, but you could be saying this and actually your company does nothing and we wouldn't know necessarily. And that's a problem on one side for not only for the people who are told we are advancing social progress and then the company doesn't, but also on the side of the company who tries to use their position to advance social change, but isn't presenting it publicly. So I think even outside of LGBTIQ questions, transparency and accountability are values for corporations which are very fundamental if we're talking about corporations as entities which advance social justice.
Yeah, you've hit spot on the tension. Absolutely.
Gareth, what do you think are some recommendations for companies or organizations that are listening right now?
Generally speaking. Wow, big question. I think focus internally and externally, making sure that you're not, driving an imbalance on those two sides. Making sure that what you do externally feels authentic to your internal population, and of course to your external consumers and beyond. I think making sure that to Nanu's point, that you are bringing in all perspectives and that it's not all the same flavor of LGBTIQ+ is crucial, and that can be challenging in some parts of the world where we are more homogenous in some countries than others, and that's a reality. I think listening is crucial.
Yeah.
And that includes listening to voices like Mariana's, where she's rightly challenging us to be thinking about, are we transparent enough? Are we doing enough? Don't shut down those conversations. Have the conversations. I think that's important too. There will be some initial thoughts, Cody.
Thank you. I know I'm putting on the spot, but I love what you said earlier about going beyond the four walls of the business. It's a great metaphor. And how do we show up for LGBTQI plus people in the world? So thank you for that. Nanu, do you have any biggest recommendations?
Big recommendations. So I like to break it down on different levels. So global thinking, employers or multinational companies engaging in their federations, i.e. employer organizations at the national level, and encouraging that dialogue to happen, and bringing those issues into international fora, OECD, in the UN, through their different bodies, through the different organizations, not just as multinational or different as business stakeholders alone, because we need to get that dialogue happening. Number two, I think, is, indeed going to, Gareth's point, yes, I think teaming up at the national level in those federations as well, and working with companies. We've seen that. We've done that in, for example, in Malaysia, when it came to laws on forced labor, a group of companies, reached out to the LO, look, can you help us? Got together, helped them through their federation to hold negotiations and discussions with the government, and openly and transparently to have laws changed. So that can be done. Now, it may not be done on decriminalization, but there are other areas that, perhaps, I think the decriminalization debate is often a difficult one, but when it comes to other areas of rights, it is important. I think the other thing is, recognizing that EIGs and the creation of EIGs, there are many businesses that are actually stopping them or preventing them, and our EIGs, and by stopping and preventing, are you fundamentally curtailing the freedom of association, collective bargaining as well? EIGs or business, I mean, we're only talking about the private in certain sectors here, where we have this new phenomena of EIGs in finance, banking, law firms, medical, pharmaceuticals, perhaps tier 1, tier 2. But when you start to go down into the lower ends of the supply chain in tier 3, 4, 5, what's happening there as well, right? Are we seeing union activity? Are we seeing anti-union activity as well? That can also be damaging to LGBTIQ plus rights as well, because that can actually be a platform. Also, I mean, where you do have unions, encouraging your unions to actually do more on these issues as well. What are you doing on LGBTIs? What are you doing on gender equality? And having those discussions with your unions and workers' organizations on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, all three of you. I'm so grateful for you showing up today and volunteering your time to be in this talk, sharing your personal experience, your professional experience in this space. I hope it's really valuable for all the youth and the companies watching. So I just want to give a huge thank you to all three of you and to wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cody.
Thank you, Creddy.
So we're going to move on to the second part of our dialogue today, the segment of the program. Before doing so, I think it's time for a little shakeout and energizer. So to commemorate World Day of Social Justice on February 20th, I'm excited to introduce a video created by the Free and Equal campaign. Wonderful. I hope you all feel inspired. I feel like joining a drum line after this video and that you had a great time. So moving on to our second segment called Moving Away from Rainbow Washing. In this segment, we'll talk with representatives of queer-led businesses and more young activists about the generational shifts in consumer and labor market demands, reflecting on how today's LGBTIQ youth keep close attention to the values and the practices of the companies they engage with as a customer, demanding accountability, as we were saying in the first session, and making sure LGBTIQ values are respected beyond pride. So to discuss these topics, I'm going to invite three more amazing speakers. I'll first invite Sarah Massey, the head of FreeQ, to introduce herself.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Massey, she, her pronouns, and my company is called Freak, F-R-E-E-Q, and you can find us at freak.love, freeq.love. And I'm very proud to say that I'm an out queer woman, and my co-founder is a trans masc person, and we are a queer tech company, and our focus is spreading queer joy online on safer tech for queers to connect. And I also want to say I'm super excited to be here and to be able to talk about business specifically because I believe the future is queer. And when we look at who is going to solve our modern problems of social injustice, environmental degradation, and oppression, I believe it's queer people who are going to solve these issues. So when you're not employing us, when you're skipping over us, you're missing great opportunities in leadership. So I'll pass that on.
That is the best. Thank you so much. Cool. Now I'll pass the mic to Ryan for introductions. Ryan, can you hear us? Okay, no problem. We'll come back to Ryan because I think he might be frozen. How about Kyuyan for introductions?
Yeah, hello everyone. Nice to meet you all here. And also thank you for inviting me to join the conversation. And my name is Chu Yan, and gender pronouns she and her. I'm a Chinese LGBTQ+ rights activist, artist, and also a member of the Global Advisory Committee and the Equal Asia Foundation. And I have been born and raised in China, also involved in LGBT grassroots movement when I was a first year undergraduate student. Like launched some like say no to homophobic textbook or teach out for LGBT, all this campaign to promote the equal treatment of LGBT communities. And I came to UK in 2018. And also because I found there's not enough support for Chinese queer diaspora. So I formed an organization called Queer China UK, because we want to like how to work toward so the gender equality, LGBT discrimination, and also the racism together in the like intersectional perspectives. And now we want to create I always on the process of creating a business model to make profit. Also at the same time, we also can make social impacts. And now our current work is we want to advance the East Asia's and LGBT inclusive perspectives in the fields of art, business, cultures, creatives, education, and tourism. So I quite look forward to having more conversation later.
Incredible. Thank you so much. And Ryan, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hey, sorry, I got disconnected for a moment there. Hey, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And for those who are going to be watching this in the future, my name is Ryan Figueiredo. I use the pronouns he, him. I'm the founder and executive director of an LGBTI think tank and innovations incubator based in Bangkok called Equal AF or Equal Asia. So we work on a number of intersecting issues, including aging, climate justice, mental health, and the future of work. We provide that critical link and close the gap in the big blind spots around this work in the LGBTI movement in Asia. I'm really glad to be here with you all today.
Thank you. I'm glad all three of you are here. Thanks for the introductions. So just to make sure we're on the same page before we dive into the dialogue part, for those of you that don't know about what rainbow washing is, it's when a business, conglomerate, other for-profit organization uses the rainbow or the pride colors to signal to consumers that they support the LGBTQI community without having to put in actual effort or produce a tangible outcome for queer people. So this generation of young people are more aware of their consumer behavior than ever before. So continuing the accountability conversation, my first question for Sarah Massey, let's start, is what actions can be taken to hold companies accountable when their values don't align with their pride marketing?
I mean, I think it goes back to one of the first things I said, is that when a company's values are not aligning with queer values, you're not going to get us as consumers, you're not going to get us as employees, and you're certainly not going to get us as leaders. And that means you're missing out. And I think I come from the United States of America. We have a major issue, which is that our social media companies are categorically unsafe for the LGBTQ plus community. And those are mega corporations I'm speaking of. And, you know, as an LGBTQ plus person, I don't want to use the services. As allies, family members of queer people don't want to use those services. And then, of course, like I said, you're going to miss out on us as consumers, but also as employees. So that's kind of like the negative, but the upside. So we're a completely LGBTQ plus business. And this is my third business. I've been an entrepreneur since 2005. I've always been queer. But one of the things that is really important is being totally transparent. Who are we employing? Who are we working with? We're always seeking to do better. We meet every week and talk about, are we also employing across the spectrum of people? I'm white and cis, but are we employing transgender folks? Are we employing people of color? Where is our money going? Even to the point of like, where is our money in tech going? We're a tech business. And so we recently we're moving servers because we found a zero carbon company to work with. What I want to say is that for any corporation or any employer or anyone who's thinking about this, first of all, do you understand what queer values are? That's number one. Have you talked to an LGBTQ plus person and talked about queer values? And we'd be happy to talk with you. So if you want to have that conversation, please reach out to Freak. And then, you know, after we talk about our values, are you really being safe? So that's why I kind of talked about technology in the beginning here. Is mega social media safe? If you're not safe, how are you even going to be an employer? And so I really think that for us at Freak, safety first. That's what our common words that we use. And I would just challenge any corporation to think about that as well.
So interested to know more. How about I pass the mic to Ryan of what actions can we do to hold companies accountable?
I want to flip that on its head and to kind of say, what can we do to hold ourselves accountable? I think this is about the time that a lot of companies reach out to organizations and individual activists and individual LGBTI influencers to begin the process of pinkwashing in that month of May and June, and so where they can be seen as organizations that are all inclusive. And I think we kind of get swept up in that frenzy and we forget the real queerness of our identity and the real queerness of our struggle. I think Mariana did mention that earlier in the first session. We're also LGBTI refugees. We're also people living with HIV. We're drug users. We're sex workers. And it's easy to forget that pride is, and that's probably at the time when you have this this call for people to come and speak on this issue and on these panels. We forget about these people, and we are more than willing to throw them under the bus and trade in the struggle for celebration. And I think there is so much unfinished work that we forget to kind of address in these conversations that we have with companies and organizations. Last year, I had to say some very uncomfortable things on a very big panel about how, when we talk about inclusion of LGBTI persons, it's not about only about their gender and sexuality. It's also about addressing the fact that, historically this community has been kept out of these conversations, and that they are poor, and that they are homeless, and that they are struggling during this pandemic. And if we don't talk about these issues, and if we don't walk gently around these issues as well and speak about them, then we're not really doing justice to the movement, right? So I think when we are accountable to ourselves, then we are able to then hold others to account in a much better way, and in a much more loving and kind way. So I think this is something that we haven't done really very well. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought us together and has really kind of demonstrated to us that we really need to show solidarity. And it has helped us unpack what that solidarity is. It's really kind of looking into our own backyard and seeing who we have left behind, is recognizing our privileges, reckoning with our privilege. Like what Sarah says, it's really important to see how we are using our privilege also to stifle other voices. So I think this is important, Cody. I think as we go into Pride Month, I hope that we can do better as a community, both regionally as well as globally. Only then we will really be able to kind of hold the private sector. I think it's a really tall order to kind of hold the private sector when we don't have our own house in order. Over.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Chuyan?
Yeah, I want to add some points, because I think how the young people can like promote, they can be like accountabilities. I think there's quite a lot of the roles we can place. Like you don't need to be like professional activists. Like for example, you are consumers. You can stop buying their product, stop consuming their service. Like the things you can do is just simple as the consumers. Also, maybe you are employee. Like you can resign, or also because I noticed in UK many companies they will have LGBT network, they have Chinese network, women network. You can use the resource within the company to maybe speak up for you feel it's quite discriminated, or you feel it's not inclusive. You can use the resource in the companies, or maybe you are artist or writer, you can write something and post your article online. And also maybe young people, they have social media channel. You can retweet something, you can comment. You have to show your solidarity online. I think this is the one thing everyone can use within your capacities, within your if you are afraid, come out, and it's still many ways you still can contribute. And another things, because I think it's quite I see some positive achievements by this one, in the UK situation. I can give an example. For example, the Pride in London, many people complain that there is all about money or about business. It's no longer the celebration, the revolution for all queer people. But I in the last few years, I feel the LGBT community, they have many demonstrations. They have Reclaim Pride campaign. They also write many articles on social media. But in the end, last year, the Pride in London, they are the board member, they resign and they recruit the new member, and they do make some changes, but it's not enough. But still, you can see your activisms can bring some positive changes. So yeah, and another is you also can use the resource from other LGBT organizations. They maybe have some the workplace equality index or some assessment. You can, for example, the Stonewall, they will list 100 best employers each year, if my memory is correct. So you also can use all these resources to figure out which company they do a good jobs this year, or which is not. You can use all these reports or this media anything to do advocacy.
Thank you, all three of you, for sharing about transparency, the importance and the necessity of reflection, all these practical actions that we can take. And continuing the conversation from the first session about not just saying like the business sector or organizations, we're really looking at like small and medium enterprises, different levels of the supply chains, even in large companies. And we know the importance of small and medium enterprises, particularly those are led by queer people. Therefore, my question is, what actions can be taken by, it can be companies and organizations or governments or anyone. What can we do to support small queer-led businesses? And maybe Sarah Massey, I'll start with you since you are.
Since I own a queer business, first of all, one of the things I have to say, and it goes to, you know, the companies that are not necessarily, you know, queer, but we as a community, in my experience, we buy together. Like once we find out, in the same way that once we find out that a company rainbow washed or was also, you know, performative for other communities, we'll take our business away. We do the inverse, right? So when we find queer businesses, we tend to be very loyal. And so I have to thank our community for that, because we launched a year and a half ago and we already got 15 businesses, 15 partners to come on board with us. And we're always looking for more, by the way. And then as a small business and a woman-owned business, for me, I've got to get out here and I'm looking at diversity initiatives for investment, for sponsorships, for grants, because that's where I'm going to find the resources to help me build faster, to help me build my business faster. And so I would love all of the mega business, you know, world to see what I see, which is a loyal consumer base, which is a population that's ready to be engaged, a population that I find on the vanguard. So we specifically at Freak look at entertainment, because that's an area in the LGBTQ plus community where there's people spending resources, right? People go to clubs, shows, performances. So we also look at that area. You know, we have the resources there, and we want to be able to broaden out beyond entertainment to bring safer tech to anyone who might need it. And I also wanted to bring up entertainment for a moment. As leaders, when people think, again, maybe I'm coming from an American or European perspective, but when I think of, you know, culture, I think of George Michael, Madonna, Prince. I think of RuPaul's Drag Race. I think of some of the most incredible leaders in the arts are LGBTQ plus. And, you know, like I said, our business looked at entertainment, but we also looked at the informal sector. So many of us as LGBTQ plus people are doing, you know, we're teaching dance, we're dancing, we're singing. And so we've been able to employ through workshops, LGBTQ plus people who are participating in the informal sector. So there's a whole area of money and workers and opportunities that are here that are not being tapped because the majority population is still bigoted and oppressive. And if someone's gonna say it, I'll say it. The majority population is oppressing and marginalizing LGBTQ plus people. We're not doing it to ourselves. We're the ones who are being othered. And so I think there has to be an acknowledgement of that as well. So I'll pass that back.
Yeah, totally. And continuing on like the question of how do we then transform these systems of education of organizations, of businesses, and maybe even with the first or the second question, maybe Chuyan, so just to switch up the order.
Yes, I want to answer the question about how to support a smaller queer-less business, because I also start my social enterprise, and we are also a team of Chinese queer and non-binary women. So we also feel we are marginalized in the society. Like we are not originally from UK, so we don't have like the network of person. We don't know not familiar about the resource here, but we start business because we think it's important for our communities. And during the lockdowns, it made us quite more difficult to access all resources. For example, like we want to have like build an online platform, or we maybe also want to how to reach out to our communities, but it's quite hard because at the on the one hand, like the racism rising, so many like Chinese people, they are disappointed about living or studying in the West, and so this quite like or almost impossible if they want to like buy some expensive service from us. So I want to like lower our price. But on the other hand, we need to find some income. So we like contact some investors or maybe contact some bigger companies. And this brings some opportunities because of pandemic, they also want to show they are anti-racism. So, but it's quite like the like rainbow washes, maybe just like performative eyelashes, something like that. We can like have like this sense of feelings, but we did list the opportunity. So we are quite like active to reply. Also maybe some cooperation opportunity. We also like catch these opportunities, but it's quite still very hard. So I think the first one, more cooperation opportunity is important, even though maybe you are not familiar how to be a realist eyelash, but we had to start cooperation, start dialogues. And the second, also I'm thinking the just simply support is also important for us. For example, I start a social enterprise here. My family, because they are in China, like they will think you are start an LGBT business, it's like impossible. You are like, people discriminate you, or you are not welcome, something like that. But if they can see some like big company or the government, they support our business or support the LGBT business, and they will like change a kind of like can change their like change their like concepts about like LGBT. So yeah, I think this maybe for the Western queer, they will have that they. Because I don't know, because I feel like in East Asia cultures, it's just simple support is quite important. And if like for specific the practical way how to support, maybe like something incubation program or mentoring or just like network opportunities, I think all these need this. And on the other hand, I think it's not just not just saying like they help us. I think it is the way we benefit each other. Like just like Sarah said, the world is clear. I think as for the leaderships, we had to querying the leaderships. Like I run some leadership trainings and ask some people why they don't want to take the leadership roles. And one comment is that they will think like the leadership position is quite hierarchy. It's about like inequality, power relationships. So it's quite like the heteronormative society. So this feels uncomfortable. So I think, maybe in some company or in some cultures, the leadership, the definition of leadership or the leadership, the environments, maybe it's not friendly to the LGBT. I think we need to change this definition of leadership, and like all of us, our career can like querying the leadership.
Yes, love that. And change the definition and querying the leadership. Love that. And it goes to my next question, starting with Ryan, of what can we do to support young LGBTQI leadership inside organizations? How can we get more young queer people into seats of power so they have the ability to contribute meaningfully to change?
I want to take, I also want to kind of speak to what Sarah was saying earlier. And this is a 2-year project that we are doing in partnership with the Canadian Gay and Lesbian Chambers of Commerce in Canada and Samavesh, the first LGBT Chambers of Commerce in India. This is a 2-country project that is focusing on, doing exactly this, creating the leadership spaces especially amongst entrepreneurs, making sure that there is supplier diversity, there are more inclusive trade fairs. This is all in India. And in Thailand, we're focusing on the gig or the informal economy. We understand that there are a lot of young people, LGBT young people, who choose the informal sector to work in because they can, they don't experience the discrimination and stigma that they would have in the formal sector. But at the same time, it's fraught with risks, right? The COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed this this weakness of the informal sector. They have no social safety nets, and many of them have no jobs. They are doing multiple jobs. In Thailand, we're looking at what are called as the platform economy. So people who are employed by the Lines, the Grabs, the Ubers, and who are trying to kind of earn money through these platforms, online platforms. But because they are informal workers, they do not have the safety nets that an employer would have provided them if they were full employees of that company. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we kind of demonstrate how important these informal workers are to the economy as a whole. And if we want to bounce back as an economy, we really need to take these people also on board and make sure that they are protected and that they are taken care of. I think there is so much that we can do to make sure that these people are seen and heard. The cooperative movement, which has been such an important movement, especially when there have been financial crises over and over again, is such a good example of how we need to cooperatize ourselves to make sure that we are coming together in common cause to address those risks that we have now faced because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, I think what was really scary for a lot of people who are involved in the informal sector is that they experienced this kind of homelessness. They were sleeping on couches, their friends' couches. They had to go back home, where they were experiencing bullying, harassment, and even sexual violence. They were going without food and meals. They lost their insurance. So we know what happens to our siblings when when the world crashes around them. And so we can't afford for this to happen again. And so the work that we do as we build leaders, we have to look into the future. We're very good at being reactive, right? We are always there for our people when we need to be there. But we also need to look at what is changing in the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's an aging workforce, or it's a completely new kind of work. Are we preparing our communities for that future of work? If we are still teaching people how to sew and how to do jobs that will not be there around in 10 years, then we're not really building for the future, and we're not building resilience in our communities. So this is what I think we really need to kind of do within our leadership. We need to kind of out with the old, in with the new, and really kind of think about what is it that's going to happen in the future, and perhaps project and kind of come together and think of those threats, emerging threats. Pandemics is one of them, but rising extremism and failing democracies is another thing that we need to look at. We also need to look at natural disasters in our region, in Asia and the Pacific, which is one of the most impacted by climate change. We need to also be responsive to that also, right? We need to think of what will happen if XYZ thing happens. Many of our countries are really fragile countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. And a small disaster, quote unquote, can really kind of change the way our communities live in those countries. So we really need to be cognizant of that, and we really need to start thinking of what we can do now so that when those things happen, we are better prepared and we can come together more quickly to respond to that emergency.
That's so interesting. Sarah Massey, do you mind if I continue with you about like preparing for the future of work, transforming? Yeah. And I heard like not only like the people, but the mindset, the skills that are needed, all those different things.
I'm so grateful to be in this conversation with y'all, because people might see me as a CEO with a fun entertainment tech company. And I hope that a lot of people do see that. And we are super fun. And we are entertaining. And we are seeking to build emotional resiliency at Freak. All of our events have the elements of fun and education and engagement and cooperation and connection. And we are determined, because we are also looking to the future, to advance LGBTQ people in tech, right? So we're building, so we worked in the entertainment sector because that's where we naturally found our folks, and we found money, right? People pay to be entertained. And then we have talent. And in this way, we can take those resources. They're also really interested in safer tech and employ coders and builders. And you can tell I'm not the CTO because I don't know all the things that we do in that cloud. But that means that people can be employed as long as they have an internet connection and a computer. And we are definitely looking at that as a social justice issue as well, right? We're coming from the States and we're coming from Europe, where we have that kind of access pretty readily, but not everybody else does. But so when I'm thinking of the future of work, I'm thinking of how do I get to both someone who wants to work in tech with us, and also the person who wants to be an entertainer on our platform as well. And so we absolutely are going to do tech initiatives to ensure capacity. But the future of work also means that, unlike those big social media tech companies that I talked about at the top of this conversation, we're going to be a good tech company where salaries are open and honest or transparent, where the environment is taken care of, where people are safe to be who they truly are. And I don't know of any tech company that's taking it on in the way that we are. Because that is where so much work is going to be. When the middle class is pushed out of manufacturing and service jobs, where are we going? Again, now that might be an American perspective where we have a strong middle class that is shrinking. Now I'm kind of outing myself as a political scientist. Yes, a longtime activist in Washington, D.C. I have 2 public policy degrees. But I took that concept and I moved it into creating a platform that generates money through capitalism, because I believe that that's one way that we can push hard as queer folks. So when we prove that we can create our own companies, that we have consumers, that we have producers, and we have employees, which we've done for the past year and a half. Now we at Freak, I'll just be totally transparent. We know that we need an investment to grow to meet the demands of the folks who want a safer tech solution. So let me just tell you, we're on a technology that looks a lot like the tech that we built, but our tech is a lot more secure than the technology that I'm communicating with you on today. And it takes multiple layers of security to get into Freak. But, and then when people find out that we're not using AI to look at their video, and we're not taking their data, and we're not selling their data, people want to be on Freak. So we have the demand, we're building the tool. Thank you for asking me about the future of work, because again, I think it goes to, as a marginalized population, we are solving these problems. We are solving the exact problem that you're talking about, is how do we create jobs? How do we create digital security? How do we take care of our community? How do we employ entertainers at good rates with good salaries, not just exploitative, which all of those entertainers that are on those other social medias are being exploited right now. They're not getting paid unless they get all the way up to the top, right? You come on Freak, you get paid. I think it's a really potent question. It's the time. I'm grateful that the pandemic made me think differently. I was doing live events. I was doing big, huge events with big populations. Well, those events, I don't know that we're going to have those in the future. So we move them online. Live events can be very resource intensive, right? Everybody flies into something, flies in somewhere. That's also if people have the money to do it, which goes, thank you, Ryan, for reminding us to like take the internal check that not every queer person is white and cis and European. And we have to do the work to bring the whole family together to move us forward. Thank you.
And like this space too, of being together, like being able to do this and have a global queer youth dialogue. I mean, that's powerful. So to wrap up this section, what do you think, and I'll start with Chuyan, what is the one thing you want the audience, one or two things you want the audience to leave in their mind, like really salient in their mind from both of these segments today?
Yeah, well, many things, but the key points is like the first one for the like young LGBT people in the workplace. I think like giving the friendly environment and policies are the key points. So that's why they can be themselves. The second is about visible, because like when I start my activism or my enterprise, I cannot see the role models. So I'm thinking I'm quite alone. I don't know like other people doing the same things, but through this conversation or through something like incubator program I join, I find some like my people, like we can like support each other. So I think the visible is important. And also the last point is about when I'm thinking about the LGBT business, I think what is the difference between our other business? Because the main thing, the one point is because I think we are grow up with trauma. Like for example, in my life experience, I grew up maybe like facing some school bullying. Like when coming out, I become homeless. Or also I had some like sexual harassment as a woman. And all this difficulty restrict our capacity and imagination. So I think I'm a quiet person, but it doesn't mean I don't have capacity to be a leader, but just maybe my trauma, previous trauma, just like restrict me. So I think we have to recognize this one. And when recognize, you think why this support or this principle is all important.
Thank you. And thank you so much for bringing this up in this space and for sharing that. We're really appreciative. Thank you. Ryan, some one or two points you want people to leave with.
I'll tell you what I'm leaving with, and I think this is something that as I share this space with a fellow activist, I'm reminded again and again that there is this fierce urgency of now. Not every one of us has the benefit of incremental justice. I think where we can fight and push for more and deeper inclusion, we should. But at the same time, I think we should also, when we talk about inclusion, we should think of it as a long-term practice of living gently with one another and with other beings on this planet. And that's the real hard work. It's to be kind to one another and to kind of see where we're coming from and to recognize the queerness in all of us. I think this is something that if we can take this back every time we talk about inclusion, I think we'll come out of these meetings less angrier and more animated to do better within as well as outside.
Thank you. And Sarah Massey?
Well, that was so eloquent and beautiful. Thank you. I'm just gonna, like what I started with, I wanna say again, the future is queer. Our famous martyred leader, Harvey Milk, said, everybody knows an LGBTQ plus person. It's just that we as a society have not created the conditions that they can be out. And I think it's a real tragedy. For me personally, I really identify with what you were saying as well around the oppression and the trauma and sexual violence. That's just not a society that's fostering who we all are as full human beings. And I would like us to go forward and to create a place where everybody can feel safe being out
Love that. Thank you so much. Thank you, all three of you. I'm so inspired by all three of you queer leaders going into the world and creating better worlds for LGBT and all people. Thank you. And thank you for being here today to share your personal, professional issues, topics, the heart, the mind, all of these things. So I'm just really grateful for you being here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, have a nice day.
And thank you for everyone that's watching now live and watching a recorded version of this section of the Queer Youth Dialogues. Remember, this is a year-long campaign, so we hope you continue to join us in the next session and that together we can build a stronger global youth movement for LGBTIQ human rights with more resources, more support, and more power. If you are particularly interested in any of our speakers, you're encouraged to connect with them. If Sarah Massey's contributions piqued your interest, you're encouraged to join our section next week called Safer Tech for Queers to Connect, where you'll have a dialogue with Team Freak about how advocacy and activism can be achieved safely online using their bespoke platform. You can find out more on the Global Queer Youth Network's website or by clicking the link shared in the chat box now. Please follow our social media channels for more information. If you are a young person, sign up for the Global Queer Youth Network's mailing list via the website, of which is now also being shared in the chat box. In summary, stay engaged with us in this work, with your community, as we move forward stronger together. Thank you so much.